The multilingual problem has always been, and is today, one of the most interesting problems in modern linguistics. The definition of the term multilingualism, as well as related terms bilingualism and trilingualism, has changed and expanded over time, which has led to the inclusion of new meanings in the concept of multilingualism. Ideally, the term multilingualism is used in the sense of proficiency in several languages to the same extent as monolingual people speak their native language. Accordingly, the terms bilingualism and trilingualism as varieties of the term multilingualism mean in this case an equally high command of 2 or 3 languages. In Kazakhstan, bilingualism mainly prevails. This is bilingualism, that is, the coexistence of 2 languages in a person or in the whole people, usually the first native and the second acquired. Kazakh and Russian bilingualism is the main reason for the current language situation in Kazakhstan. 75% of the representative of the G2 nation speak Russian as a second native language, and secondly, by Russian-speaking, Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Poles, Germans, Koreans, Greeks, Moldovans, Morvins, Jewish Russian, etc. communicate with each other in Russian. National Kazakh-Russian bilingualism, Uzbeks, Uyghurs, Turks, Kurds, Azerbaijanis, Tajiks, Chechens, Kyrgyz, Tatars, Dungans, Bashkirs, and etc. It's important to note that in percentage term in the multilingualism of different ethnic groups, excluding Tajiks and Uzbeks, the Russian language dominates. The Russian language began to penetrate into the territory of modern Kazakhstan in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, when the Kazakh Ruzes one by one became part of the Russian Empire. In the middle of the 19th century, the Khan's rule was liquidated, and office work and public activities began to be conducted in Russian, displacing, as a result, the Kazakh language into the sphere of private family communication. For a long period, Kazakhstan was part of the Russian Empire and then the USSR. Then, the Russian language was fundamental throughout the territory of the Union and de facto the state language. The law on languages adopted in 1989 introduced the concept of state language in the Kazakh SSR, and the Kazakh language was given the status of the state language, and the Russian language was assigned de jure status as a language of inter-ethnic communication. The development of language processes in society is conditioned by the social environment of the language community. Such indicators as economic, social, and cultural development form a kind of linguistic environment. In a multi-ethnic society where several languages intersect, the language space is divided. Language processes, as social ones, can undergo changes due to the influence of various social factors on them. From this point of view, language processes in Kazakhstan can be regulated and changeable. In Kazakhstan, any government initiative aimed at the development of the state language failed. The unsolvable problem of the Kazakh language has been and remains an instrument of political manipulation all these years. According to research, we managed to find out that, in the opinion of many Russians who live in Kazakhstan, the Russian language is strongly oppressed by the Kazakh language. So much so that this circumstance, they believe, is the main reason for departure of the Russian Slavic population from here. This is their opinion, and it should be respected as the adherents of democracy call for. But it is also true that the same number of Kazakhs in Kazakhstan, in turn, are sure of the opposite. The fact that, on the contrary, the Kazakh language, the state language, is oppressed by the Russian language. It is difficult for an outsider to understand which side is actually right here. The law declaring Kazakh the state language of Kazakhstan came into force 17 years ago. At one time, he was received in our country by some with satisfaction, by others with concern. Now, after a period that is quite sufficient to summarize the main results of the implementation of this legislative act, in our opinion, the prematurity of those emotions become obvious. The only actual state language remains Russian, and the situation apparently will continue for a long time. Why is this happening? There are many reasons for this, but the most important and obvious of them is that both Kazakh psychology and national public thought as a whole, which existed for many decades as compilation reflection of similar Russian categories, were not ready for independent creative activity, capable of reviving the language and bringing it to the level of multifunctional means of communication. The former Kazakh language was not adapted to fill the entire spectrum of social functions, at least for the Kazakh-speaking part of the population of the Republic. But within the limited scope of application, it was very tolerably systemized. Now, with perseverance worthy of better application, attempts are being made to make Kazakh a full-fledged public language. Huge budget funds are actually spent on achieving results. Today, more and more people speak Russian and some only speak Kazakh, but in this case, in large cities, people who don't know Russian face problems in communication, service, and much more. According to statistics, 74% of the population understands Kazakh oral speech, while 94.4% of the Republic residents understand Kazakh. The dominant role belongs to the Russian language. People who don't know Russian simply cannot buy basic necessities if the consultant seller does not know the Russian language. Also, with work, it is almost impossible to find a job without being a native speaker of the Russian language. The same can be said about information portals. Of course, Kazakh news is published and broadcast in Kazakh, but foreign news is rarely heard or read in the Kazakh language. If we consider the other side, the problem is that there are few good vacancies for Kazakh-speaking specialists. Moreover, they, consumers and businesses suffer from this. Today, the demand for Kazakh-speaking specialists is much less than for Russian-speaking ones, at least in large cities. Over time, the situation will improve, but by that time, the current youth will already be middle-aged people. And for many of them, the opportunities that could have been will not open up. At the same time, the business loses a lot because it loses the breadth of maneuver in the labor market. A business pays insufficient attention to Kazakh-speaking clients, to be more precise, communications with such consumers. Meanwhile, quite a lot of people already know Kazakh better than Russian. Also, after conducting an interview, we asked my employer why Kazakh-speaking specialists are less in demand now.
Everything has become quite opposite. Now, specialists with knowledge of Kazakh language are increasingly in demand, primarily in communicating with clients, banks, shops, and insurance companies, that is, where they work directly with their population. Although it is still easier to get an office job with a good knowledge of Russian and Kazakh, even if the candidate does not speak Kazakh at all.
Moving to the next part, according to statistics, about 70% of the population of Kazakhstan speak Kazakh. But after conducting a social survey, we managed to find out that in Almaty, young people mostly communicate in Russian. We interviewed one of the Kimab University graduates and asked him how difficult it was for him to get a job without knowing the Kazakh language.
I was looking for a job in finance, and having participated in more than one interview, I received several refusals due to the ignorance of the Kazakh language.
From this interview, it can be concluded that the salvation of the Kazakh language is to protect it from attempts to remake it for all modern sciences, and its first prosperity is based on the correct choice and clear definition of those spheres of objective reality and subject knowledge, which, by their nature, naturally nourish the Kazakh language and are its soil. Such a life-giving soil is the entire cumulative sphere of culture, from the folk epic, music, literature, and up to national holidays, the sphere of true religion and morality, which has yet to be revived, and of course the international communication itself, which preserves the spiritual integrity and national individuality of the Kazakh people, simultaneously combining with all spheres of life. Thus, the condition for the life of the language is the adequacy of its application, and its prosperity is contained in those areas of life that are urgently needed and significant for people of Kazakh nationality and inextricably exist together with the Kazakh language. The strength of the Kazakh language lies in its individuality, specificity, and special way of thinking, which is created by the rules of the language and its grammar. Therefore, the main question facing Kazakh specialists is where and how to properly use this force and not compete with the Russian and English languages, which initially have different structures of language rules. And the last group of our research is foreigners. Foreigners in Kazakhstan face the main difficulty for them, ignorance of the language. Communication with colleagues, with clients is sometimes not easy, since in Kazakhstan, the majority of the population does not know English well. In order to survive in a global society, a new approach is largely needed. Everyone should understand their responsibility to the future of their country, but there is a tendency that foreigners come into Kazakhstan to try to learn the Kazakh language as quickly as possible. According to a study on social networks, the Kazakh language is given to them in learning quite easily. Of course, the Kazakh language is necessary, but Russian and English are needed for international communication. As the former president of the country, Nursultan Nazarbayev, said, "Contact with Russian culture has played a very favorable role for Kazakhs. Russians, through which we entered the word culture because there were no historical, cultural, scientific translations into Kazakh, we reach all this through the Russian language, through Russian culture." Due to the polyethnicity of society in Kazakhstan, there are many identities, ethnic, religious, linguistic, and others. But today, more than ever, we need a common one for everyone, unifying and consolidating. And such, in our opinion, can and should become a linguistic identity. Of course, we mean the state language, but in order to form such an identity, we need change our thinking, consciousness, change our guidelines, get rid of old stereotypes and duality and a wait-and-see attitude. At the same time, we must remember that the way to comprehend the soul of the people lies through the knowledge of the language. Only through it we will be able to fully plunge into the bright, kind, pure, rich and amazing beautiful spiritual world of the great steppe. In conclusion, we deem that we need to learn the Kazakh language and speak it. We really need a language environment so that those who want to learn a language have the opportunity to develop it, improve it, and acquire conversational skills. Of course, it is impossible to oppress people who speak other languages. It is only necessary to push and motivate them to study the Kazakh language. Russian and Kazakh languages can and should coexist, providing full-fledged information services to the multi-ethnic people of Kazakhstan.